Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event on Experimentalist Governance from Architectures to Outcomes with Bernardo Rangoni beside me. I'll make introductions in a minute. My name is Jonathan Hopkin. I'm a professor of comparative politics at the European Institute and in the Government Department here at LSE. It's a great pleasure to welcome Bernardo and our other guests for this evening. This is the launch of Bernardo's book, Experimentalist Governance from Architectures to Outcomes. And we're delighted to be joined by Neil Maloney and Anthony Keithfield to comment on the book. So before proper introductions, I'd like to make a few requests for warnings. So please put your phone on silent, don't use your phone, just in case, to not disrupt the event. The event's being recorded and will be made available as a podcast, assuming there are no technical difficulties. There will be a chance for you all to put questions to our speakers. For the online audience, you can submit questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Please include your name and affiliation. And for those of you here, well, when we open the Q&A, please put your hands up and I'll try and pick people out in a roughly sensible order. And again, please wait for the students to bring the microphone to you. And please, again, let us know your name and affiliation. Okay, and for those of you using X, formerly known as Twitter, the hashtag for this evening's event is hashtag LSEEI. Okay. So, what's the event about? Well, Bernardo will explain much better than I can. This book on experimentalist governance develops an analytical framework to overcome the limitations of contemporary debates on non-hierarchical governance. It analyzes 5 crucial domains: electricity, gas, communications, finance, and pharmaceuticals in the European Union, and examines when, how, and why non-hierarchical institutions affect policy processes and outcomes. So combining temporal, cross-sectoral, and within-case comparisons with process tracing, the book ultimately illustrates the conditions, trajectories, and mechanisms of non-hierarchical governance. So just to briefly introduce our speakers more thoroughly, so Bernardo Rangoni, here on my right, is an associate professor in the Department Politics at the University of York, and Marie Curie Fellow in the Department of Political Science at the University of Antwerp, and visiting Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center at the UI. And of course, a product of the PhD program in the Government Department here at LSE. Neil Maloney, next to him, is Professor of Law at the LSE Law School, Fellow of the British Academy, and Honorary Member of the Royal Irish Academy. And Anthony Teasdale, further over to the right, is a visiting professor in practice at the European Institute here at the LSE, as well as being an adjunct professor at the School of International and Public Affairs of Columbia University. So, just a quick word about how we're going to organize the event. First, Bernardo will speak. He'll give us an overview of the book. Speaking for about 25 minutes. I will be watching carefully. And then we'll hand over to our discussants who will speak for around 10 minutes each. And then we'll move into the Q&A. And I guess at that point, probably I can hand over to Bernardo to give us a summary and introduction to the book published by Oxford University Press. I think we should, these days, physical copies of books, I think, still mean something. Here's the book here, published by UUC. Bernardo, over to you.
Thanks a lot. All right. Okay, so thanks a lot for the very kind introduction. And thanks a lot, to those who organized the event. Thanks to the discussants, and also thanks to the participants who made up, time, both in person and online. All right. So indeed, as Jonathan just mentioned, I was fortunate enough to publish my first book with OUP, and I'm gonna kick off my presentation by saying, why we should care about all these themes, and I'm gonna do that by referring to sadly familiar events related to COVID-19 vaccines. So as we all know, there were big issues with the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine developed here in the UK, and here you have a picture of a poor young man who died a few hours after having taken a COVID-19 jab. We also now know that there might be risks of stroke in certain categories of patients when the COVID-19 vaccines are combined with other medicines. We also came to realize that there can be heart-related issues, again, as a result of COVID-19 vaccines. And even from the BioNTech and Pfizer vaccine, which is the vaccine that was mainly used in Europe and which was much less problematic than the AstraZeneca one, we can see here in an article by the FT that hundreds of Germans are claiming for compensation. So what has been the response from the regulatory regime perspective? Well, here you see kind of a simplified diagram that shows a kind of life cycle. So the development of medicine starts with some in vitro and then in vivo tests. Then we have clinical trials on a certain amount of patients. Then there is a rather inclusive procedure which might end up giving the authorization to market medicines, after which medicines, included COVID-19 vaccines, starts being used in wider populations. But the process doesn't end there. And so I've highlighted the safety monitoring, because once medicines are authorized and being used in wider populations, then there is a whole system called pharmacovigilance. So in the EU, we have the so-called EUDRA vigilance, which collects millions of reports that can be sent by doctors, by patients, by national regulators, and so on and so forth, about suspected side effects. Okay? So there is a huge effort in collecting data after the initial decision has been taken, and this might lead to revision of the initial decision. So this is, of course, an extreme case, but in the case of the BioNTech and Pfizer vaccine, we saw 23 revisions, in a very short period of time, because the initial marketing authorization was given in December 2020. Okay, so all this, I think, it really shows the importance of being ready to change your mind, to be ready to change your initial decisions in the light of uncertainty. And luckily for us, over the past 20 years or so, there has been a spread of non-hierarchical arrangements, which include regulatory fora, networks of regulators, and networked agencies. And these non-hierarchical arrangements create the potential for learning from different implementation experiences. Now, the problem is that the real effects of these institutional structures on policy processes and outcomes are understudied. And this is where the book comes in. So the overall question of the book is when, how, and why regulatory governance is shifting away from conventional hierarchical governance. And as most of us know, conventional hierarchical governance features top-down imposition and compliance enforcement with stable rules. So to anticipate my key findings and argument, if we look at actual governance processes, we see quite a lot of variation. So in not all cases where these non-hierarchical arrangements were available, this led to corresponding policy processes, okay? But when non-hierarchical arrangements led indeed to non-hierarchical processes, these non-hierarchical processes were oftentimes not temporary. They were there to remain. They exhibited quite a lot of resilience over time. So if I had to summarize my key argument, I would probably say that when we look at governance, we should not limit ourselves to analyze formal institutional arrangements. We should instead recognize that actors do have agency and exercise agency. So they make choices about when, how, and to what extent to use the arrangements available. And I'm going to argue that functional and political pressures are particularly important in shaping actors' choices. So if the overall aim of the book is to problematize and analyze the relationship between structure, processes, and outcomes, I've then raised a number of specific questions. And these questions relate to the nature, conditions, trajectories, and mechanisms of non-hierarchical governance. So first of all, what does non-hierarchical governance mean? Then under what conditions are actors likely to use it in practice? Then which trajectories best capture its long-term evolution? And finally, what mechanisms help it to overcome gridlock? And these questions, of course, relate to a number of key open debates in regulatory governance. So first of all, we have an influential interpretation that the four networks and agencies that I've just mentioned, they demonstrate the emergence of an experimentalist architecture. There is a very influential argument out there, but there are, of course, critiques, and the critics say, okay, it might be that we have ignored until recently this experimentalist governance approach, but what about the pre-existing forms of governance, which have not disappeared all of a sudden? So what's the real balance between these new forms of governance and the hierarchical traditional ones? Then there's a debate about scope conditions. So the experimentalist scholars argue that the key drivers of experimentalism are uncertainty, a polyarchic distribution of power. So the argument here is actors will only engage in these time-consuming, inclusive processes when they do not know the best solution beforehand. Otherwise, why bothering about it? And the same applies to multipolar distribution of power. If actors have the power to impose their own preferred solution beforehand, why should they bother about all this more inclusive, time-consuming processes? But the experimentalist literature has not paid much attention to politics. And this is a critique that you find oftentimes in theories of learning more generally, that they tend to be apolitical. And if we look at another literature on regulatory networks, we see that political factors are often contrasted to functional pressures, though they are presented as rival. Then there's a debate about trajectories. So here you have a pessimistic account, if you like, which basically says it might be that at the beginning of the regulation of a given sector, actors do engage in these experimentalist processes because at the beginning, they're really navigating a virgin territory. But after a little bit, they start learning. They navigate in an environment which is more familiar. Okay, and so in that sense, experimentalist processes lead to their own decline because they endogenously reduce uncertainty. Others say, well, but it might be that once you resolve a given problem, new problems emerge, sometimes from the implementation of the solution to the previous problem. Okay, so you might actually have self-reinforcing dynamics. And finally, we have a big debate on mechanisms. What's required to avoid the impasse? So here, a widely canvassed view goes by the name of shadow hierarchy. So the argument is oftentimes public authorities will indeed delegate to certain parties the authority or the task to come up with solutions because these other parties, they have better information, okay? However, if you leave them on their own, these parties will end up in gridlock because easily they will have redistributive conflicts. Okay, so they will end up being blocked. And so, what's the solution to this? Well, then public authorities should threaten to retake control of the regulatory process. Okay, and by threatening this, then they will be able to induce cooperation and avoid gridlock. And experimentalists, from their side, they reply, yes, of course, it's true that oftentimes you have distributive conflicts, and so you need indeed some incentive to avoid gridlock. But in a world pervaded by uncertainty, as they claim that is the one that we live in, public authorities no longer have the capacity of retaking control. They wouldn't know what to impose. Okay. And so we should call these threats penalty defaults rather than shadow hierarchy. All right. To contribute to these debates, I developed an analytic framework, which first of all goes beyond institutional structure to study actual policymaking processes. And that's indeed necessary to assess the real balance between different forms of governance. And here are the indicators that I've used to distinguish between hierarchical and non-hierarchical governance. I should clarify that these are ideal types. So empirical reality may only partially approximate these ideal types. I conceptualize non-hierarchical governance as experimentalist governance, but that's certainly not the only possible way to conceptualize non-hierarchical governance. But having said this, these are the three indicators that I've used. So we are before hierarchical governance when rules are developed and imposed from the top. So in the EU context, that would be from the European Commission. Then compliance is monitored with these rules. And these rules are supposed to be stable. They are supposed to be fixed over time. Instead, we are in front of non-hierarchical governance when rules are proposed at least partially by lower level actors, which again in the EU would be national regulatory authorities, for example, or regulated companies. Then the performance of their different implementation experiences are benchmarked and reviewed. And finally, this is supposed to lead to revisions in the light of indeed the best performing approaches. I also looked at conditions, and in particular, I appraised functional, legal, and political factors, because as I said, there's a gap on the politics of experimentalism, so I really want to shed more light on that. And also want to test whether functional and political factors are really rival, as another literature suggests. Then I have also looked at how these three factors might evolve over time, and that's necessary to study trajectories. At the moment, the literature gives us some diametrically opposed claims, but these are claims. They are really based on very thin empirical analysis. So we need to do more on that. And finally, on mechanisms, I try to distinguish more clearly the shadow hierarchy and the penalty defaults. And so there, what I argue is that both literatures, they suffer from concept stretching. So it is unclear what is not shadow hierarchy and what is not penalty defaults. Both concepts tend to be very, very encompassing, and this is problematic because then we cannot falsify the relevant claims. So what I propose in the book is that we are in front of shadow hierarchy when the threat is of a specific positive solution. Say the European Commission threatens to initiate legislation, but when we are in front of a threat of fines or revocation of a license or expulsion from a process, then we are before negative penalty defaults. All right, now on research design, I looked at 5 key sectors, electricity, gas, communications, finance, and pharmaceutical in the EU. I did that over the past 1 or 2 decades, and I broke each of these sectors into 2 subcases. So I looked at 10 subcases in total. So overall, I combined temporal within case and cross-sectoral comparisons with process tracing. Why these cases rather than the many others that I could have looked at? For a number of reasons. First of all, they are important in and of themselves because they have cross-sectoral effects. So for example, we are all familiar with the fact that when energy prices go up, also the prices of every other good goes up. We also know that when there is a financial crisis, this also has an impact on the real economy. Then the EU as a polity and these 5 sectors as policies are where the experimentalist structures have institutionalized most, and therefore they've been available to actors. Now, of course, the question is whether actors have really used them in practice. The cases also offer a number of combinations of legal, functional, and political factors, and that's useful to understand under what conditions actors use these experimentalist arrangements or not. These experimentalist structures have been available for significant periods of time, and that's necessary to study trajectories. So there we really want to study different policy cycles and see if, for example, the initial engagement with experimentalist governance is spreads across different policy cycles, or is just an initial fling, let's say. These cases also offer the number of positive and negative mechanisms to overcome gridlock. So once again, the question is which of these mechanisms were really used in practice by actors? And finally, these are hard cases or unlikely cases for effective non-hierarchical governance. Why? Because these sectors are notorious for the well-entrenched interests that populate them. Think about big pharma, think about big tech, think about too big to fail, okay? So if non-hierarchical governance can deliver outcomes even in these difficult cases, then we can be more confident that it can do the same also in relatively easier cases. All right, now that I gave you all this abstract information, give you very briefly a taster of how the empirical analysis really looks like, and then I'm going to give you a very quick bird's eye view on all the empirical findings, and then I'm going to wrap up and conclude almost in time. So if we compare network access regulation in electricity and gas, we see quite an interesting variation. And by the way, for some people in the room, this is very obvious. For others, they will not know that, but non-discriminatory access to transmission lines or to gas pipelines is really crucial to allow competition, okay? Otherwise, if suppliers, importers, and so on, they don't have access to these natural monopolies, they cannot compete with one another. So that has been identified as a key issue area from the late 1990s to promote competition and market integration. In both cases, there were multi-level, multi-stakeholder fora. In electricity, there is the so-called Florence Forum. In gas, there is the so-called Madrid Forum. They meet in Italy and in Spain. They discuss electricity and gas, but they are the same from all the other aspects. So they bring together European Commission, national regulators, governments, transport operators, suppliers, generators, consumer organizations, and sometimes even academics. Now, if we look at the processes, however, and the trajectories, we see something very different. So in electricity, we see that for 20 years, basically, a multitude of actors have been exchanging and debating experiences, and they came up with non-binding agreements, which were then regularly codified in EU legislation. Okay, so we really see quite a lot of experimentalist processes in practice, and also their extension over time. In gas, instead, we see that there was some benchmarking of different approaches from the late 1990s to the mid-2000s, but then by the mid-2000s, the processes became much more hierarchical, much less inclusive, okay? Decision was made for a given solution, and compliance has been monitored with it ever since. So we see that there was an initial flirt with experimentalism in gas, but then there was a return to more conventional hierarchical processes. How can we explain such a variation? Well, if we look at formal powers, they don't really bring us very far because formal powers were exactly the same. I argue that if we look at uncertainty and opposition, then we get a better understanding. In electricity, the European Commission didn't know how to solve this problem beforehand, but neither did other actors. Okay, so they really had to learn it from experiments and experiences. In gas, instead, by the mid-2000s, the Commission became convinced that it knew already what had to be done. It was very simple: a stricter enforcement of a stricter version of the existing model. And it was also not alone in that belief. It was supported by very influential regulators, namely the Austrian and German ones. And so, equipped with stronger cognitive confidence and also with a strong coalition, it could then impose its preferred solution on recalcitrant actors. All right, now very quickly, on the overall findings of the book. So what I want you to take away from this table is simply that in all the cases I looked at, there were experimentalist arrangements available, institutional structures available, but not in every case we saw experimentalist processes. Okay, so I have highlighted the positive or experimentalist cases in green, but you see that there are also others in red where, despite the presence of experimentalist arrangements, processes were actually more hierarchical. When we look at sequences over time, we see quite a mixed picture. So there is a relative majority of cases where experimentalism lasted for a relatively long period. But again, that was not always the case. And I discussed the example of gas, when after an initial engagement with experimentalist processes, we saw a return to more conventional governance approaches. And from this table on the mechanisms, you can see that, yes, in a couple of exceptional cases, negative penalty defaults were the only game in town, okay? But in most cases, actors relied on a combination of mechanisms, positive and negative, to overcome agreement. So how can we explain the use of experimentalist governance processes? Well, I the importance of opposition and uncertainty. And indeed, I have cases which I've not discussed here for matters of time, where actors had very strongly centralized powers, antitrust powers vis-a-vis Google, for example, and yet didn't go for a hierarchical approach. Why? Because of uncertainty and because of political opposition. Conversely, when actors are confident and supported, they might be able to override polyarchical constraints. And in terms of resilience, again, my argument focuses attention on uncertainty and opposition, in this case, re-emergence. Okay? So oftentimes I found in my cases that actors did solve an issue and did form a coalition around a given solution for a given problem. But shortly after, they faced a new problem. And then they had to restart again, experimenting, discussing, and so on, and maybe creating also new coalitions. They couldn't rely on the previous one. All right. So what can we learn from all this? So the first message that I want to deliver is that when we study governance processes, we should not only look at institutional arrangements, we should also look at actual policy-making processes. And that might sound banal, but it's easier, it's less time-consuming, and it requires less sectoral expertise to look at institutional arrangements on paper, okay? But if we make inferences on that basis, we might get it wrong. We might get it wrong simply because actors regularly do make choices about whether, when, and how to use institutional arrangements available. Okay? Sometimes they ignore arrangements available, other times they convert it to other uses that were far away from the original ones. And indeed, if we look at processes in practice, we can find quite a lot of variation. And I've argued that this variation is less influenced by legal powers than it is by political and functional pressures. So here also another message is that indeed actors might use non-hierarchical governance in order to foster learning and also to facilitate the creation of coalitions. Okay? Of course, we should study rather than assume trajectories. And if we do that, then we might end up challenging conservative views. Indeed, overall, I found stronger evidence of self-reinforcing dynamics. So I basically challenge the view that these non-hierarchical forms of governance are a temporary phenomenon and they are doomed to wither away. Okay? And finally, I found that non-hierarchical governance can deliver policy outcomes even in difficult cases, even in difficult sectors. How? Thanks to a mix, thanks to a combination of mechanisms. Indeed, most of my evidence suggests that negative as well as positive threats are often used together. And this is different from what is either implied or explicitly argued in the literature. And I'm going to stop here and I look forward to our discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Right, so over to our discussions. Neil, would you like to start?
I think hopefully you can hear me. Is that good? You can stay here. It's a huge pleasure to be here. And Bernardo, first of all, huge congratulations. It's an absolutely super book. I really enjoyed reading it. So really fantastic amount of work and analysis, and I think a serious contribution to the literature. So as Jonathan said, I'm from the LSE Law School. I'm a lawyer and I specialize in European financial regulation, and particularly the European supervisory agencies, which Bernardo covers in one of the chapters of his book. So, and it really does shed new light on how to think about this area. So I've got three kind of comments. The first and second are quite short, and then the third one is really more about the financial market space. And so first of all, it is a fascinating analysis, your book, of how regulatory governance, which my lawyer friends hate, but I think we know what it means. It's sort of the stuff that's kind of making the economy move. I think if you stand back, it's a great analysis in the widest sense of how regulatory governance has been evolving. You adopt as your frame of reference the emergence of novel architectures of non-hierarchical governance, from regulatory fora to networks of regulators and network agencies, and the related shift away from conventional hierarchical governance, which, as you say, is defined by the top-down imposition of stable rules and related enforcement. And I think what's really interesting about your analysis is it's very rich, it's very skillful, but you're probing not just that this is happening and sort of why it's happening, but the effect of process and outcomes. So I think that is very significant. And is the kind of the emergence of this sort of new form of governance, does it support effective outcome delivery? So I took sort of a lot away from that. And this is my first remark. It's an important contribution on the deep wiring and process of regulators. And that's becoming an increasingly significant part of regulatory studies. So here in the UK, we have the ongoing post-Brexit reconfiguration of the financial regulators, namely the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulation Authority, new rulemaking powers, but also new objectives. And famously and controversially, the regulators now have a secondary objective to support economic growth and competitiveness over the medium and longer term. So big development, probably going to kind of have a bit of a recasting about how the regulators operate, their capacity, their operating model. And your book, kind of by diving into how regulators think, I think gives us more of a toolkit on how they react to external impacts like that. So I found it very, very helpful in that regard. And then secondly, you use as your analytical toolkit, the experimentalist governance approach, which I really like. I think it's a very attractive way of thinking. It's been very influential on my own work. And I really applaud that you kind of took that way of thinking and really kind of almost pushed it to its limits in your book, which is just fantastic. And as Bernardo says at the outset, not to repeat, but experimentalist governance is a mode of governance defined by discretion by lower level actors, review of their implementation experience, and then rulemaking and revision in this light. And then as Bernardo has just gone through, using this toolkit, the book explores across different settings, and that is a huge strength of the book. A series of questions, including the extent of this non-hierarchical governance and whether it's doomed to fail or more likely is it going to transform conventional governance. And then you also consider, as you've explained, the impact on it of the political as well as the functional and marvelously legal factors on this, right? And ultimately, I think you do see that the experimentalist paradigm is not sort of a state of nature. It is influenced by legal, functional and political pressures. So to my second very brief point, I think your book captures a period of very significant change in EU regulatory governance across different domains and settings. And you use experimentalist governance to great effect because classically it's a little bit siloed. We see it here, we see it there, but you are looking across the piece and showing how it behaves differently in different settings. I thought that was a very powerful analysis. And for me, seeing the financial market piece put into analysis with other major policy settings, electricity, gas, comms, and pharma, is really new. Because people tend to think, oh, financial, very scary, very technical, very weird, very odd, and tend not to bring it into this kind of debate. So I thought that was a really very big contribution, and I want to thank you for that. So then thirdly then, so it's a financial regulation person drilling a bit more into, I think chapter 5, isn't it, Bernardo, on financial markets. I really did find it very thought-provoking. So here's a few last comments about this. So Bernardo, forgive me, just a little bit of deep sort of background context for everybody. But financial services, financial market regulation in the EU has been the site of really huge legal and institutional innovation for about 30 years now. The exigencies of managing market liberalization and containing cross-border risk, and of course those risks crystallized to disastrous effect over the financial crisis. But that kind of set of challenges has seen repeated cycles of reform. And those reforms have tested the limits of law, politics, and even treaties. Now, I think this period can be marked into three areas, with the liberalization period, 1998 to 2008, when it's opening up markets, hooray, the dot-com boom, it's all kind of fabulous, and everything is opening and liberalizing. The crisis era, around about 2008 to 2014, and my goodness, I mean, experimental governance is sort of the glint in the eye, really. Like, it's massive retrenchment. It's a monolithic single rule book. It's an epochal shift to administrative rulemaking. And then on to the current period, where we're seeing a kind of a tilt to liberalization, very, very slightly. But I think where your work comes in is, it takes us away from those three fairly classic ways of thinking about it and saying, well, it's not actually a massive single rule book. It's not actually these monolithic regulators. There's something a bit more subtle going on in the middle of all of this. And this is where you're bringing out more the institutional side of what's been happening. So alongside all the rules, we've had the construction of banking union, supervision by the European Central Bank of the banking sector. And then where you focus in on particular is the three ESAs, the European supervisory agencies, that have a single market function when it comes to financial markets. And you focus in particular on ESMA. So ESMA is the financial markets one. And in your thought-provoking chapter, you show how, notwithstanding this sort of classic, oh, these powerful European agencies, post-financial crisis, very powerful, lots of kind of a hard power in some respects. But even within that, we still see the non-hierarchical governance, the experimentalist approach. And you're right, one of the examples you pick up on is ESMA has very unusually direct supervisory powers over credit rating agencies. I just really to emphasize, it's kind of unheard of for the agencies to have direct supervisory power. And as you say, they have the power of life and death. They can authorize, they can take away authorizations, they can shut them down. And the example you bring out is, notwithstanding this power of life and death, you show us that they can't actually do something that intuitively is super important. They cannot dictate to a rating agency how of what rating to give. You're triple D, you're triple A. And if you follow financial markets, you'll know, I mean, famously, rating agencies have huge power over financial markets. And will rate your securities can really move markets sort of globally. And you say, well, you know, they can't do that. Even though they have all this power, they can't do that. So that suggests that there is a degree of non-hierarchical governance going on. And I agree. And I think here's where your argument really comes out here, because you do explain that the political context at the time those powers were given to ESMA was really febrile, and that's absolutely right. The downgrading of Eurozone sovereign debt over the financial crisis was a huge political sort of, you know, uproar at the time. They were never going to give ESMA the power to directly, I think, interface with financial markets. But here's my challenge. Do you think law was actually more important here? So ESMA is actually prohibited from directing rating agencies how they go about the business of rating. Now, okay, ESMA could tip up to the edges of that power, and it hasn't. So maybe that's more the argument. You know, it could push closer than it has. But still, I wonder, could you give law a little bit more of a sort of credit there? Secondly, and super quickly, the market context. Now you have this really nice phrase, the cognitive uncertainty being important for the extent to which experimentalist governance comes into play. And the market context is hugely important here. The market would take massive fright if ESMA was suddenly interfering a lot with ratings. And I wonder if you could maybe almost have the market as a whole separate context here. It's not just functional, legal, and political, but the huge forces of capitalism are also sort of something that's here. And then finally, I have 3 questions for you. Do you think when it comes to non-hierarchical governance, there is a distinction between supervision of what's happening in the sector and rulemaking for the sector? Secondly, do you think that some of the experimentalist tools that all the agencies use, I think in all the sectors, including ESMA, peer review, guidance, you know, setting objectives, classically experimentalist, but is that hierarchical by the back door? You know, kind of we raise the eyebrow on peer review, you kind of get to the same place, really. And thirdly, final big question, perennial question, we're going to have a financial markets regulation. Central, classic hierarchical governance. What would you predict based on your analysis? Thank you.
Thank you. Should we go straight over to deal with your responses in the Q&A? Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for that really interesting exposition. And I just enjoyed reading the book, and I found it extremely thought-provoking on many fronts. I'm going to my perspective comes a little bit from actually not my being a visiting professor here and there, but actually the previous job I did, which was to be Director General in the European Parliament for research. Parliamentary research, we have set up the European Parliamentary Research Service. And of course, the clients of the Parliamentary Research Service are more than anything else, the members of the committees of the European Parliament. And I was thinking as you were talking about if this was a group of MEPs sitting here, or political group staff in the European Parliament, or officials in the European Parliament, what they would make of what you had said. And I think their first conclusion would be, we have here a kind of closed world of policy making and decision making, which is kind of depoliticized and to some degree cut off from the rest of the EU political system. And how far were the political authorities conscious of the extent to which, over time, this kind of rather detached and independent series of fora for policy making would evolve? So that's kind of my first general reflection on this. And secondly, I'm very struck by the way that you handle politics in this. Politics seems to be almost a kind of residual factor. You mentioned at one point that the decision makers in the regulatory field are influenced by politics and by various kinds of uncertainty, by the inherent uncertainty of the economy or other environment, and political uncertainty, and particularly difficulty of what happens if you confront opposition to. But I mean, there's another way of looking at politics, which is essentially about choice and accountability. And I think that's what, if we were sitting here in a parliamentary context, people would ask about choice and accountability. How far are these choices being articulated? And how far is the public in any way being involved in this process. Having said that, I liked your book very much. And one of the reasons I liked it was because it was not confined to the conventional European studies or political science way of thinking about the European Union. It was kind of free of this whole debate about supranationalism versus intergovernmentalism, about federalism versus the role of the nation state and so on. It's attempted to kind of slice through this completely by simply asking the question, if you like, in an almost brutal way, like I think it was Harold Laswell with this famous book in the 1940s, I think it was, who gets what, when, why, how, which ultimately is a kind of brilliant definition of politics. And I like the fact that it didn't seem constrained or particularly bothered or caught up in the question of, what were the actual formal allocation of powers? Where was the EU, where were the EU institutions operating through original competence, like in competition policy? Where was it through co-decision? Where was competence moving from level to level? Where was it somewhere that you have to have these other forms of new governance, which you don't actually mention, but which kind of come into, or you may mention, so I didn't spot it, which come in different ways over time, like soft law and other kind of mechanisms which people were very caught up with 15 or 20 years ago. The third thing I liked about this was the way that you explained, though you didn't go into perhaps as much detail as you could, the way in which the EU system is a kind of admixture of these different layers. And I think you put at one point that the whole issue of experimental governance is how far it replaces or displaces existing forms of EU governance and how far it coexists with existing structures. And I think that's quite an important component here because it offers the chance to invent new, flexible, fluid solutions, which hopefully, if the relevant players and stakeholders are fully involved, has a certain legitimacy, not least because it is addressing an issue that has to be confronted. I'm personally a very strong believer in the notion of what Alan Millward described as the European rescue of the nation state. That is, that European solutions evolve as collective solutions which individual countries cannot offer, but when they need to develop. And the kind of de facto reality is then at some point in the future converted into a de jure one. So sovereignty sharing, in effect, evolves as a result of practical necessity, not because of the kind of field choice. Now, in that context, I suppose the question arises, when does experimental, or put it this way, how experimental is experimentalist governance? I mean, at what point does something cease to be an experiment? I mean, you talked about, as one of your 5 areas, the financial services field. I mean, the supervisory authorities there were put in place, I think, in one statement as a result of the General Rosier report, about 15 years ago or so. And they are fully established components of the system. And as I just alluded to, the key question is now, well, why not merge them and perhaps make them even more stronger and more powerful? So what's your kind of sliding scale on experimentalisms, as it were, in terms of structures and in terms of choices? I mean, does this process simply solidify, or does it atrophy, or does it need to be constantly reinvented? And what are the drivers of that process of reinvention? And then I suppose my final point is you talk about this thing being non-hierarchical. We, of course, fully understand what that means in this context, which is that it's a non-entirely top-down process in which decision makers in Brussels, through the classic EU political system, somehow legislate and then through, say, comitology or whatever, decide, but rather that it's a process in which there's more of an open bottom-up participation. But if I'm right, as I suggested in my original remark, that in fact, actually, this is quite a closed system. It's not one that has much resonance with the problem. Do you think it's possible that what you describe in your book may turn out to be a kind of period piece in the way that you're describing regulation and the EU's evolution of regulatory direction as it was during the tail end of the 20th century and the early 21st century, and that in the future, we will find that many of the areas that you talk about will become much more politicized. First of all, because there's less respect for technocrats and experts in inverted commas. Secondly, because the substance of the decisions that have been taken, let's say on energy prices or energy markets or pharmaceutical licensing, whatever it might be, are going to become much more controversial. And thirdly, because with the internet and social media, there's simply no way in which experts can any longer contain knowledge and understanding of the issues. We've already seen this to some degree in EU trade policy. If we went back 25 years ago, EU trade policy was narrow. It was entirely the domain of technical experts with hardly anybody outside looking in. And now it's been exploded into an area where everybody has a view. And because it is, it's cross-cutting in some different policy issues, it's kind of become very, very politicized, quite controversial, and quite divisive. So are we about to see this process in the areas you study, and that rather than being a system which is self-sustaining, it may be a system which is gradually about to either run out of steam or be completely exploded and open up political forces which will de-technocrate, it will make it much less technocratic and much more open and much more political.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Do you want to hold off and go into Q&A?
Yes,
or-
yes, yes.
Yeah, brilliant. So I guess you'll pick up those points in the course of your remarks now. Great questions. Fantastic. Would you maybe say who you are and the microphone?
Oh, yeah.
Cheers, thank you. So yeah, I'm Neil Mortimer. Thanks for the invite, Bernardo. Really enjoyed that. So thank you. And I'm looking forward to picking up a copy. As you know, I focused on experimentalist governance in my master's with Jonathan in Amsterdam, and my PhD focuses on policy learning, of which experimentalist governance is closely related to in many ways. I think it was great discussion as well, but I think it was the omission there was talking about the pharmaceutical case study. And I wonder if you could elaborate more on that, and perhaps, when you looked at COVID vaccines and directives in the EU, whether you could theorize about potential COVID-19, for example, or crises giving way to more non-hierarchical mechanisms and systems such as experimentalism. Yeah, thank you.
Shall we select? Okay, yeah.
Hi, so I'm Hanan Haber. Thanks, Bernardo, for the presentation. Looking at your analytical framework, so you have experimentalist and then you have hierarchical. What was striking for me was that a lot of the things that you say as experimentalist to me just look like policy, right? You have many policies are suggested by industry. Okay, pretty much everything is suggested by industry, and we know this, right? And if you look at, it's interesting, Anthony mentioned Laswell, because if you look at the final stages of policy, there you have evaluation, right? And things might change. But if you look at the policy cycle, right, this is from the 50s, you have evaluation, and then you have, to change policy somehow. So maybe you could, for the uninitiated, kind of highlight the difference here. What is new about experimentalist?
Jacopo Gronchi, student, PhD student at UCL, also working on experimentalist governance, but in a different domain, industrial policy. My interest is into the question of intentionality, into the design of experimentalist governance structures. Most of the literature recounts stories of how these architectures emerged as if actors stumble upon them. And this is also an expression that Chuck Sable, the main author behind this theory, uses. But as uncertainty looms around and the policy relevance of experimentalist governance as a theory arises in this context and is also championed by others in new domains, such as industrial policy, the question is indeed, what are the implications for policy itself? How can one such architecture be designed and implemented given the subtle nuance that separates it from a classic policy cycle? So doubling down on the question that was asked before, what is the secret sauce that makes experimentalist not such any other process of policy learning?
So, so let me start by announce. So experimentalism is not only about discretion for lower level actors, okay? So you indeed have discretion for lower level actors, but then you have monitoring of their different implementation experiences and learning from it. Now you're right, this takes a number or engages with a number of steps of the policy cycle. That's correct, but it's not correct to say that experimentalism is only decentralization or discretion. Now, on the last question, so yeah, actually, I don't think it was Chuck. I think it was Gronja de Burke that came up with stumbling into experimentalism, and what. So she wrote that in a chapter because she was basically arguing that some actors ended up in experimentalist processes not being fully conscious of that, and not indeed, as you say, not without much intention. I wrote a piece with Jonathan Zeitlin a couple of years ago, and there we also pick up this terms stumbling into experimentalism, and there we identify a number of pathways that can emerge when actors face uncertainty and problems. One, for example, would be that they come up with solutions to a given problem, and then they think that they are done. Okay, and at that point, a new problem will emerge or might emerge, and then they will stumble again into experimentalism. Okay, but you can also imagine that at some point actors start thinking, okay, let's be a bit more cautious here. Yes, we solved that specific problem, but it has happened so many times that new problems keep coming up. Let's set up some arrangements so that we keep developments under our eyes, and then we are, let's say, more ready. Okay, so in other words, they internalize uncertainty. They are less confident. All right, Neil, the question I didn't really understand the question on orbit.
Yeah, I meant more in such in. Did you notice that, or do you think or theorize that crisis conditions can give way to more non-hierarchical mechanisms or experimentalism?
Well, so on the pharmaceutical example, I mentioned the COVID-19 vaccine, which of course is an extreme case. But if we look also at the other medicines authorized with the so-called centralized procedure, which is not centralized at all, it's a misnomer, then we see basically the same processes. I mean, we see this huge pharmacovigilance system, and we see revisions. Most of the time, these revisions are not dramatic. It could be revocation of an authorization, but most of the time is adding new product information, making some changes to the patient populations, and so on. So I would say that you find the key driver. Chuck Sabel would say that the key driver of experimentalism is uncertainty. So as long as actors interpret the crisis as a situation of uncertainty, then you would probably find it. If actors are very confident, and maybe they are wrong to be so confident, then you wouldn't find that. So I think it's also very important to underline perceived uncertainty. And interestingly, I interviewed some people, for example, in the European Commission, in DG Com, and the competition director general. Somebody, I will not mention whom, he told me we didn't know what to do in this case. I don't think I'm an economist. For me, it's not something to be ashamed of, but my legal colleagues, they think differently. So there are also variations across sectors in how people are ready to embrace uncertainty. In the pharmaceutical sector, I was impressed because you find in the publicly available documents EMA, not the European Medicines Agency, they say, clinical trials cannot fully eliminate uncertainty. We should need and keep monitoring and so on. But in some, especially in some legal circles, that's a much more uncomfortable. Yeah. Maybe I can say something. Okay, so your comments are really fantastic, and I will not be able to make justice to them. I need a number of weeks to think about them. But I'm gonna address selectively some of them. So thanks a lot for the very nice words. And okay, so the first question you had is supervision different from rulemaking? So I know where the question comes from, because of course the experts in financial regulation will make such a distinction. From a theoretical perspective, from an experimentalist governance theory perspective, this comes back to the question by Anna about the policy cycle. Experimentalist governance has to do both with rulemaking, so that would be the initial decision, but also with monitoring. And there is where you get the supervision, and then with the revisions of the initial choice. Can peer review, guidance, etc., be used hierarchically? My reply would be absolutely yes. The message of the book is, we really should be very wary, because instruments, they might be formally or on paper, they might be, dedicated to certain objectives, but then, actors, they can manipulate them, regularly. I can give an example from my home country, from Italy. We have this law decrees, decreto legge. They also, so with that you can bypass the European Parliament and you can issue laws very quickly. And in theory, that is supposed to address emergency situations, urgent situations. In practice, they are used all the time. Okay, so. Right, and then the question: are we going to see a single regulator? I don't know. The people studying like Mark Thatcher, for example, they would say there might be functional reasons for that. The economists would underline them, but then you have political resistance, including from existing bodies who don't want to lose their jobs and so on. And so this is where functional pressures meet political resistance. Okay, Anthony. So did elected politicians anticipate such a developed world of depoliticization and this circles and all that? I would say no. But then I want to go back to with your last question, which is very much connected to this one. We can imagine that there might be more politicization in certain areas, and we saw them. In energy, when energy prices go up, then you get citizens are unhappy, citizens are also voters, therefore then politicians step in. But in a project we did with Mark Thatcher and Alex Stone-Sweet, we asked whether this politicization leads to de-delegation, so to a reversal of delegation. We found no. And one of the key reasons is because now these bodies are embedded in multi-level contexts that sometimes protect them against elected politicians. So, for example, oftentimes, the Spanish government has withdrawn, has removed some powers from the national regulator, but then the European Commission stepped in and said, "Hey, what are you doing? This is illegal. You need to undo this reform." So I would say there is a lot of politicization, but this might not lead to changes in formal institutions. And then the third point you had about de facto versus the jure developments, and you know when something ceases to be an experiment. I mean, that's also fascinating point. Oftentimes we see indeed that these processes might emerge without intention, let's say, not by design. But then if actors come to consider that these processes were pretty useful, then they might say, you know what, okay, let's now create an institutional structure that facilitates these processes by design, essentially. And yes, politics can be understood in different ways. Indeed, you're totally right. What I try to do in the book is shed more light on politics, which is really overlooked in experimentalist literature. But indeed, I understood that as matters of coalitions and resistance and so on. And so you're totally right. It's a very technocratic book with all the problems that might bring in. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Okay, more questions? Oh, we have a, okay. Yeah.
Question from Bruno Cunha from the Institute of Applied Economic Research from Brazil. Congratulations on quite an interesting book. 2 questions. Can we then summarize the adoption of experimentalist governance as a way to tackle opportunities as opposed to existing and measured problems, the latter being natural candidates for traditional governance structures? Second question is, in your research and data collection for the book, have you realized that particular state capacities or organizational skills, notably in regulators, organizations, and professionals, clearly enable the successful adoption of experimentalist governance? Interdisciplinary teams or mindset, for instance. We have other questions online as well. Should I follow?
A couple there, so maybe a couple more.
Okay. Mark Thatcher asked, could you discuss feedback? Could you discuss feedback mechanisms from experimentalist processes into institutions and institutional architectures? There's another, but like, yeah, okay,
Take note then.
lovely, okay.
Great, so your supervisor wants to know.
Yeah, okay, so my reply to indeed my former supervisor is that can be the topic of the second book, in the sense that indeed in this book I only looked at the use of existing formal institutions. Okay, so I really didn't look at how policy processes might lead to the creation of new formal arrangements. But that's certainly well. This is precisely what we just mentioned. You know, that sometimes you get some more, let's say, spontaneous or voluntary initiatives in terms of process, and then they get institutionalized. Okay? Bruno, I didn't get the first question, so I need to get that reread. But the second question, yes, and if you look at the origins of experimentalist governance, it came from Japanese manufacturing systems that were contrasted to the Fordist system. Okay, and in these Japanese manufacturing systems is just implying much more flexible approach, and you have more mixed teams. So you have personnel going around in the home. Okay? And then you go on another item, for example, you have the rights in financial regulation, you have the supervisory teams looking at certain, say, banks, and then you can get, you know, some information from your peers from another country, and that might lead to learn.
I think the first question was, is experimental governance more about sort of new emerging opportunities, whereas more typical long-standing problems are more suited to traditional forms of governance, or something along those lines?
Okay, I would say that yes and no, in the sense that yes, experimentalism is very attractive when you're dealing with something novel, something fast moving, etc., etc. But it can also become attractive when the traditional solutions have failed and have failed for a very long time. So that's and this comes back to the functional side of the argument. After years and years that people and actors have seen that the widely canvassed solution not working, then the idea is maybe at some point they will start understanding, okay, this doesn't work. Let's see if we can do an experiment and explore novel opportunities.
Can I leapfrog onto and well, think back, I think it's a phrase, right? On that question, and sort of ask how you would apply these concepts to, say, emerging, well, not emerging, but we already know the problem of climate change. Right? So, this is a very novel set of problems. Is experimentalist governance more suited? Is that the best way of thinking about trying to address this kind of polycrisis?
Yeah.
Or can you use it, more traditionally?
Yeah.
Have a go at that one.
Okay, so well, I have two replies to this. The first one is if you don't ask me, but if you ask Chuck Sable and David Victor, they recently published a book which is called Fixing the Climate, Experimental Strategies for an Uncertain Future. So they argue that after decades in which the more conventional hierarchical approaches have been failing a number of times, now our best hopes are placed on partly learning from local experiments that might indeed prove better and outperform other approaches. That's their claim. If you ask me, I have a paper that I need to improve and then submit. But in the EU context, if we look at renewables, so I basically looked at how far there has been learning from in the EU renewable policy. And frankly, I didn't find much. The more interesting part of this finding is that the European Commission learned how to push through its preferred solution. Okay, so after debates in legislation and all that, at some point you use state aid where it has exclusive powers, and it said, you know what, we are going to make illegal feed-in tariffs, which we don't like. Okay, and we are going to push for market-based rules. So there has been learning, but it has been a political learning. There has not been learning in the sense of, the more genuine or, the one you would expect in terms of, let's see which schemes are better at promoting
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this question about climate change, but it also bears upon the classic regulatory areas that the book covers. I think draws attention to the fact, which is not very widely understood, that the European Commission, in using its right of initiative in the legislative process, very often is rather cautious, rather conservative, actually, in the way that it approaches the potential power which it has at its disposal if it can get the legislature behind it. In other words, it doesn't fully use often the competence which it has established legally at its disposal. And so you could interpret some of these structures that we've been talking about of a kind of more fluid and decentralized regulatory environment as a way in which the Commission chooses not to, in fact, exercise potential power, put it the other way around, not to take full advantage of treaty potential. Yeah. And why does it do that? It does it partly because the learning by doing process is something which sometimes it's easier to let other people engage in rather than make mistakes yourself. The second reason I think it simply does not have centrally the resources to do this. It's not a large enough organism. We're talking about a body of 30, 35 35,000 people. We're not talking about, absolutely massive superstructure of government. And I think the third factor is that generally it enhances the legitimacy and buy-in, if you like, not only from outside actors, but also from the governments themselves. So that the Commission isn't always used to the full its actual political potential in these fields. And so looking at it that way, I think helps explain why it is rather cautious until and unless things clearly go wrong. At which point it says this crisis has to be resolved by unambiguous European legislation, which will be more compelling than obligations. That's the way I see it, at least.
I totally agree, and I think that the policy, how I looked at the politics factor really is in your interpretation. Because indeed, I think the Commission is also cautious. Maybe it has formal power, but it also can anticipate that if it's going to use them, there will be some backlash. So in that sense, having inclusive processes are not only useful in terms of learning, but also in terms of paving the way to a smoother implementation down the road.
Okay. Oh yeah. Need to hang on a sec.
Sebastian, no. So can I ask about good old ideologies driving all this, like neoliberalism, which can explain a lot of things, especially over regulation. And you can kind of experiment within the neoliberal paradigm because you can apply a theory to a novel problem, come out with it. You can be a heterodox economist, which say, no, the whole thing's wrong, and neoclassical classical problems are never going to be solved like that. So my question more is, when is experimental? Because you can be experimental within an ideological framework, neoliberalism, and the World Bank and the OECD countries probably favor that approach. Or alternatively, you could go heterodox and you could get something very, very different again. But if we are in the world of managerialism with atomized non-grand theory, then each of your managerial things are going to be on a very specific project. You still have this teleological problem that you don't really know what's good anyway, because you can be atomized as you want, you can be as technical as you want, and you can politicize it with as many chat forms as you want, but that's still not going to help you because you might not be a fundamental agreement on it. So I suppose that's a sort of comment on when is experimental, or when is it truly experimental, etc.
I think there were some online questions, is that right? Yeah. We have Angela. So maybe a couple more from online and then.
Okay. Hi, I'm Violet Ross from Law and Environmental Policy at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Sorry if I killed this name. Congratulations. First off, my question is as follows. In your study, you separate hierarchical with non-hierarchical architectures. But did you see instruments that overlap between the two? Example, how would you define a commission regulation requiring a private standard to be established? How do your findings on the effect of politics relate to these types of instruments that may be both hierarchical and non-hierarchical?
Angelo Martelli, European Institute. Yes, Angelo Martelli, European Institute, LSE. Thank you very much, Bernardo, for the presentation. When does experimentalist governance just become governance? You just mentioned actually a very interesting case about state aid. Is it when basically it becomes embedded in the law and when it's formalized to some extent? And so therefore, are there any triggers or do you have a grid that we can apply to declare that it ceases to exist, it ceases to be experimentalist? Because going back to the issue that Anthony was mentioning regarding politics, where is the politics in all of this? I can think of other types of governance like G20 becoming the forum for discussion when the G8 was no longer the forum that could be used because of Russia presence in it. And so I'm trying to understand, when do we make the switch in a way?
Okay. So I'm gonna take this well.
Okay. Yeah, maybe one last question.
No.
Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a very splendid presentation and a very informative book. So this is the first one to borrow the LSE library. So I have two questions about it. So that as chapter 5, so the prominent Professor Moroni said about the importance of financial markets. So I'm Hideki Sato from the Department of Finance as a visitor. So my first question is, what do you think about the gap between the IO score and the ESMA, so that in terms of regulation of CRAs? So in my interpretation is IO score still is promoting somewhat for the promulgation of the CRAs, but the ESMA try to put a sanction as much as possible. But as you said, as a page 143 about it's some kind of a joint between the EBA, EIOBA, and ESMA still as to pressure and some kind of Pareto to not more imposing impactful sanctions anymore. So do you feel about the limitation or restriction about the external standpoint, such as IOSCO and European internal organizations pressures? This is my first question. And last one is just a short comment about you mentioned about the ESAs as a micro-prudential approach, but another point of view is a micro-prudential approach in European Union is a ESRB to prevent the European systemic risk. So what do you emit about the ESRB's approach? So this is the second point. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm gonna reply to Violet and Angelo. I think your questions are quite overlapping. As I said in the presentation, I understand hierarchical and non-hierarchical governance as ideal types, okay? Which means that you will not find empirical examples that are perfectly matching with this indicator. So we should understand them as two ideal extremes, and then based on the set of indicators that I used, then you categorize one as more hierarchical or more non-hierarchical. And as I said, in the book, I conceptualize non-hierarchical governance as experimentalist governance, but that's certainly not the only way. I mean, there is this other framework, which is called orchestration, and that's another non-hierarchical form of governance. So I would say that that's a part of my reply, and then indeed you need to use some indicators and see, where you categorize cases. I can also add that non-hierarchical governance, or at least certainly not experimental governance, is not incompatible with binding law. Okay, so that was a distinction that you had in the new modes of governance or old forms of governance, and you no longer find it in the experimentalist literature. So oftentimes, indeed, you have the codification of best practices, which become binding, but it doesn't mean that you have ended up in a hierarchical world. All right. Okay, and then Sebastian, your question about neoliberalism. So when is experimentation really experimental? When is really truly experimental? Your question made me think about the work by Peter Hall, in which he distinguished between these different levels, or levels, let's say, of learning. So you might have learning of a smaller scale, if you like, on some instruments. That is something relatively modest. But then you can also imagine, and this is probably what Mark Thatcher was pointing at, you can also have learning from policy implementation that leads to revisions of the whole institutional framework. Okay, that's a bigger change. So I would say, I would say, let's not think about truly either or, but let's think in terms of degrees or scales. Okay, and then we had the last question on which a couple of questions really. So in the financial case, I looked only at as in any other chapter, I looked only at two sub-cases. So as you know, in the financial chapter, I looked at PRIPS and CRAs. So I cannot really say anything about the ESRB. I mean, I can speculate, but not on an informed basis. And equally, the book was really very much about the EU as a polity. So I didn't really investigate the interface between the global level and the EU level, and so between IOSCO and ESMA. I mean, what seems quite clear to me is that with ESMA we have an increased formalization. The documents are uncomparatively lengthier compared to the codes of conduct created by IOSCO. So the level of detail is different. The powers that ESMA has, especially vis-a-vis credit rating agencies, are extraordinary. Okay, but then if we look carefully, we will see that even there is not a hierarchical approach because the EU institutions have not taken over the rate, the task of setting rates or even methodology. Actually, we got codified the principle of non-interference in that. That would be my reply.
Fantastic. So time's just sped up. This remains me to thank all of you and those of you on Zoom for joining us here. Thanks to Laura and the team for organizing this so smoothly. Many thanks to Neve and Anthony for acting as discussants. And big round of applause for Bernardo and congratulations.